Back when I was a kid, this was the best baseball game around. RBI Baseball was the only baseball video game that we thought of back in those days. I'll never forget the first few times I played this game. I was probably 5 or 6 years old. It seems that every group of friends had at least somebody who owned a copy of this game. And yet the series stagnated as the years went on. So have you ever wondered what happened to that series? Well, let's go back and take a look and see how RBI Baseball dropped from the top of the baseball video game world to basically nothing. As you probably know by now, RBI Baseball is based on the Japanese game Famista. Famista came out in December 1986 and was totally revolutionary. It was actually the second baseball game on the Famicom. The first was Baseball, a 1983 game we know in the US as the Black Box Baseball game. Now, Baseball was a port of Versus Baseball, which was a popular Nintendo arcade game from way back then. And it's actually a pretty good port if you compare it to the arcade original. But it wasn't exciting the way that Famista was exciting, and Famista's mere existence, of course, ignited a revolution in baseball games. You see, baseball made the mistake of showing the entire field at once. Playing Famista was kind of like watching a game on television with the camera panning around. And of course, moving the camera around meant avoiding the flickering and slowdown issues that the NES was so famous for. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail about how Namco got this to work. My understanding is that it was a somewhat new technique, at least back in December 1986. And of course, Namco was the first to figure out how to get it to work in a baseball game on the NES. The competitive response in Japan was tremendous. And so Namco had to keep coming out with new versions of Famista to compete. Now, at some point in time, Atari made a deal with Namco to bring the game to the United States. I don't have much information about that deal, but I do know that it happened because that's how we got the arcade version, the original one of RBI Baseball, over here. As many of you already know, the original US version of RBI Baseball was actually an arcade game. Versus RBI Baseball came out in 1987, a year before the NES version, and was a smash hit. It included teams filled with legendary players from the past. And as you can clearly see, it was made by Atari. Now, Atari used the trade name Tengen for its Nintendo video game division. Tengen, like Atari, is a term from the old board game Go. And it was Tengen that made the NES port of Famista, which we know of as RBI Baseball. Of course, the tremendous popularity of Famista in Japan was no secret. LJN's Major League Baseball, which came out before the NES version of RBI Baseball, was designed to be a clone of Famista. Now, that game is horrible, with awful controls and really bad physics. RBI Baseball was a direct copy of Famista, though it was clearly localized for the US market. And RBI Baseball was a smash hit. Now, if you're around my age, you absolutely played this game as a kid. In fact, this game was such a big hit that Tengen was able to break its relationship with Nintendo entirely. RBI Baseball was one of only 3 games that Tengen released for the NES with the official Nintendo seal of approval. You see, back in those days, Nintendo required its third-party licensees to agree to all sorts of rules before they could release games for the NES. Tengen agreed at first, but started to feel wary. After a little while, the Tengen lawyers and engineers devised a way to steal the blueprints of Nintendo's famous lockout chip. They were able to use those blueprints to circumvent the technology and started releasing unlicensed cartridges for the system. And so as a result, there are 2 versions of RBI Baseball on the NES. One is the gray cartridge, the licensed version. The other one is this black cartridge, the unlicensed version. Both were extremely popular, and I don't think that either version is worth more money than the other one. Anyway, RBI Baseball went on to be Tengen's biggest selling game and convinced Tengen to turn the game into a franchise that lasted almost a whole decade. That's why we had games like RBI Baseball 2 on the NES. The sequel is the same as the original except with some major cosmetic changes. It also includes every single team in Major League Baseball, not just 10, and the rosters are bigger. It's mostly the same game, even with that facelift. And RBI 3 is the same way. Sure, RBI 3 lets you play with all sorts of teams of the recent past, but if you look only at the gameplay, you'll realize that it's still exactly the same as the original. But none of us knew that when we were kids. I mean, this was baseball, and this is how you played baseball on the Nintendo. That's all we knew back then. Anyway, since Tengen no longer had to follow Nintendo's rules, it started to port its games to the other consoles, most notably the Sega Genesis, and unfortunately that's where the series started to fall apart. Well, this is RBI 3 on the Sega Genesis. You'll notice that the hitting is a lot different. You've got this sort of pseudo 3D perspective, and it's kind of hard to get used to. It's a lot different from the classic formula of watching the ball hit the bat. While there is a little bit of music, it's nothing like the great music of the original. And the crowd noise is just static. But, I mean, that's all minor stuff. The biggest problem with the Genesis version is the fielding. Specifically, the cameras are zoomed in too far. Now, when you look at any of the 3 NES RBI Baseball games, you'll see pretty much the same fielding perspective. It's a game of moving your guy under the shadow. Either that or you move your guy in front of the ball and throw it to first base. On the Genesis, though, the camera is zoomed in so far that you can't see your player. And this is a major problem. The more I play these games, the more I realize that the real important parts are the pitcher-batter interaction and how fielding works. The best games have great hitting, easy pitching, and excellent fielding mechanics. The games that don't do these things well tend to be frustrating to play, no matter how many teams they include or how great the graphics look. And as the RBI series continued on the Genesis, things only got worse. I hate batting in these games. I never know what the pitch is going to do. Pitching isn't much better, and fielding is usually a nightmare. Now, the fielding system is automatic for most of the Genesis games, but it's ridiculous. Like here, you've got like 3 guys going for the same fly ball. And so a game like RBI 94 might look really nice compared to the original, sure. But I would still much rather play the first RBI Baseball. Now, the final installment of that old series came out in 1995, and that really wasn't supposed to be the final RBI Baseball game. In fact, it seems that it was originally intended to give the series a breath of fresh air. Now, the fielding angle is a little bit better in this game. Although there are still some ridiculous things that happen. But the pitcher-batter matchup is just horrid. So this game used the old World Series Baseball 3D style of framing the pitch, except here it doesn't work very well. Now, I am biased. I actually think World Series Baseball was a pretty awful game.
It's a one hopper to short.
I will never get used to this way of hitting. I'll always prefer the 2D way of hitting to this.
Going, gone. Home run. Holy cow.
But RBI Baseball 95 is kind of unique in that it doesn't even do the World Series Baseball approach well. It's really hard to tell what's going on. The graphics are so-so and kind of underwhelming, especially for the 32X. Overall, the presentation is just bad. And that's how the series ended, well, until we got the new version of RBI Baseball games. But those games from the more recent generation are going to have to wait for another video. Now, the really interesting thing here is that the Japanese Famista series suffered from very similar problems, believe it or not. Once again, the problem centered around poor fielding controls and a horrible pitcher-batter interface. If you look at Famista 87, you'll wonder if anything has changed from the original. In fact, if you play each of the games in the old NES series, you will actually start seeing some changes. There were new ballparks and other things that came in over the years. The basic aspects of the NES game stayed the same, however. Pitching and hitting are the same no matter which game you choose, and the fielding is generally responsive and easy. The camera angles also make sure that you can actually see what you're doing. So this was a really easy pattern for success. How could they screw it up? Well, the high point of the Famista series was probably in 1988. This is when Namco created an arcade spin-off series called Pro-Yaku World Stadium. What you'll notice about this arcade game is that it is exactly the same as Famista, except with enhanced graphics and sound. It's also a much more difficult game, but that makes sense. I mean, this was an arcade game after all. Now, after playing a bunch of these games, I'm convinced that the arcade games were generally a step ahead of the home console versions, but most people who write about them treat both series as being completely separate, so it's kind of complicated. The first major improvement to the series came in 1992, which is when Super World Stadium came out in the arcade. The pitching and hitting are more or less the same. The fielding system has been revamped a little bit, but mostly to include diving and jumping. And the soundtrack really gets on my nerves. Super Famista on the Super Nintendo came out that year as well. And honestly, this feels more like Super World Stadium than the classic Famista games, to me at least. But the series hadn't declined much, not yet at least. The games still played more or less the way that they always played. The graphics looked better and the sound was modernized, but then things slowly started to change. So if you skip ahead to something like Super World Stadium 95, which came out in 1995, you'll notice that things really have changed. There's a big emphasis on 3D looking players now. And the batting system is gradually shifting to a more 3D perspective than the classic 2D. Super Famista 5 came out the next year on the Super Famicom, and this is where you can really see the 3D approach. Batting is a lot more difficult and just doesn't feel right to me. The fielding looks like fun, sure, but it's really hard to control your guys. But you can still see what you're doing. In that sense, the series was doing much better than the RBI Baseball games were in the United States. But the temptation to go down the 3D road was just simply too strong. In some ways, that's what killed RBI Baseball in the US, and it was about to really harm Famista. Famista 64 came out in 1997. It looks fantastic, but the gameplay is questionable at best. The fielding perspective is zoomed in, making it almost impossible to see what you're doing. And it's really difficult to distinguish strikes from balls. Plus, do we really need player names on top of every single fielder all the time? So in my mind, Famista 64 is where the series really jumped the shark, and it still baffles me. Now, back when I was a kid, I saw pictures of Famista 64 in Nintendo Power, and I thought that the game looked amazing. I always wanted to play it. Well, I've played it now, and I kind of wish that I hadn't. By the way, Super World Stadium 97 retained the old-style feel. This is really where the Pro Yaku World Stadium series splits with the Famista series. Pro Yaku World Stadium saw arcade games continue to come out through 2001 when the series ended. Meanwhile, Namco gave up on the N64 after Famista 64. It wasn't until Famista Advance came out in 2002 that the Famista series came back, and even then the games were only occasionally released. The most recent game came out in 2020 for the Nintendo Switch. It looks nice, but again I found it really awkward and frustrating, and the fielding angles are just awful. Again, this is what the classic game looked like. It's easy to field. It's easy to distinguish pitches when you're hitting. These new games look nice, sure, but it's hard to do even the most basic things. Now, I can't be the only one who longs for the days of simple games that were focused less on flashy graphics and more on making you feel like you were in control. But unfortunately, the trend over the years has been increasingly towards 3D graphics and away from solid gameplay. Now, the ironic thing is that the best version of Famista was never released in the United States. That would be this game, Pro Yaku World Stadium, on the PC engine known as the TurboGrafx 16 in most of the world. This is a 16-bit version of the original Famista, and it's tons of fun to play. The music is great. The controls are superb, fielding is simple and intuitive, and the game doesn't try to do a bunch of stupid fancy stuff. Well, back in those days, I'm sure the people who played it imagined all sorts of improvements in the future. I mean, imagine a game like this but with hundreds of vintage teams. Imagine it with all sorts of classic stadiums. Imagine it with weather effects. You could do a lot to modernize it without changing the 2D camera perspective and the simple pitching, hitting, and fielding mechanics. Unfortunately, the trend went towards 3D effects and complexity. Look, I love good graphics in a video game, don't get me wrong. However, the most important thing is gameplay, and the gameplay in the old Genesis RBI Baseball games is bad. Famista 64 looks beautiful, sure, but the gameplay is simply awful. And the latest Switch version just feels confusing to me. In my mind, the PC Engine version of Famista is the ultimate RBI Baseball experience. The Famicom sequels are nice, I guess. But no game makes me feel as satisfied as this one. And remember, when I was 6 years old, I didn't need to read an instruction manual to learn how to play this. Do you think I could have figured out how to play a game like this at age 6? Anyway, maybe I'm just an old school guy, I don't know. Still, I feel like there probably is still a market out there for these old school 2D baseball games. So what do you guys think?